Let us look today at the book of 1 Kings. But before we do that, quick review of the previous books. Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. In these two books, we see the lives of basically the first two kings of Israel. And we see how the people really yearned for a king. They demanded a king so that they could be like the other nations, to have a leader, impressive leader to lead them, and so their leader could fight their wars for them. So that's why they demanded a king, rejecting their king for the last few hundred years, God himself. So we have these two kings, and God gave them 40-year reigns. 40 years in the Bible is always a time of testing. And after the 40 years of reign, they both failed badly. Now, the first king, Saul, he spent a little bit of his earlier part of his reign really fighting the battles for Israel. But then he spent almost the rest of his 40 years, the vast majority of his 40 years, not fighting the enemies of Israel, but fighting his personal enemy, David. He was envious that David seemed to be more popular, more respected than him, and he wanted to destroy David. So instead of the king fighting their battles, they had to fight the king's battles. You see, that's how sad. Most earthly kings don't fight your battles, you fight his battles. Then we find the next one. Yeah, of course, Saul ends so badly. Goes to medium, then commits suicide. Then we find David. Wow, seems a refreshing change. Started very well. And then before you know it, as you read his life, very quickly you find he starts accumulating wives. And if you count, at least 7 wives recorded and countless concubines. Okay, so instead of fighting wars for them, he's enjoying his own life. Even Saul didn't have a lot of wives, but David had countless concubines. And then towards the end of his life, I wouldn't say towards the end, but part of his life, instead of going to war to fight, he goes up to the rooftop and looks at another man's wife, Bathsheba. And then he steals her because he's the king, he has rights to demand her to come. And then he has, as king, had the power to make sure her husband was killed. Wow, a king uses his power to protect us or for himself. So we see how David moves in that direction. And then towards the later part of his life, we find he has to fight his son Absalom because his son went into rebellion. So instead of fighting the wars of Israel, he is relaxing, having adultery, collecting wives and concubines, and then in the end he spends the energy of Israel fighting his own son. And the last part of the story is so sad because of his pride, his ego. 70,000 people died. And so 2 Samuel ends with 70,000 deaths. That's the kind of king that men provide. So while all of us yearn for a good leader, that's natural. Everybody yearns for that. Whether you work in a company, whether you're in a nation, you hope to have a good leader. But in the end, you always get disappointed. They start well generally, they end poorly. And finally, God tells us the only king that will ever satisfy you and will ever fulfill his kingly role of protecting and providing for you is King Jesus. All right, so now that's a quick review of Samuel. Now we come to the book of Kings. Now in the Bible, Samuel is actually one book, not 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. And in the Kings is actually one book, not First Kings, Second Kings. But when the Hebrew scroll was translated to Greek, Greek language took twice as many letters as Hebrew to write the same thing, simply because Hebrew doesn't have vowels, A-E-I-O-U. So every word is, a lot of vowels are dropping. You guess the vowels between, all right? But in Greek, the vowels are there, so it's twice as long. So they split the book up into 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. Actually, it's the same scroll. Now, the book of Kings is probably written long after these events by Jeremiah the prophet. Jeremiah was a prophet to the Israelites, to Judah, because of the exile, right? He wrote this probably to comfort the people who were in exile, wondering, why has our God abandoned us? Why are we in this horrible exile life? What went wrong? And so this book of Kings probably was written by Jeremiah, and maybe others added to it, but largely by Jeremiah, to comfort the Israelites when they were in exile, right? Now, of course, when we read it, it's useful for us to see it, but as far as when we read it, we always say this is just a history book. Really, these are what we call the historical books of the Bible. The first part is Torah, and then we come to the book of of Joshua, and then Judges, and then Samuel, and then King. We say these are historical books. But what kind of history is this? In Kings, it's very clear what kind of history this is. It is holy history. It is not history as we normally know history. As we normally know history, history records political events, military victories, records economic success, basically politics, military, and economy generally. But the history books in the Bible record what I would call history from God's viewpoint, holy history. Things that are of spiritual value, highly recorded. Things that are moral value, good or bad, highly recorded, because these are the emphasis, the spiritual and the moral, not so much the economic power, the military power, the political power. Those are mentioned only. Example, in Kings, some of the kings who really expanded the military might and the economic power, like Omri, king in Northern Kingdom, Jeroboam II, they did amazing military and economic things, but only 7 verses in the Bible. Jeroboam II, 8 verses only. And then a guy like Hezekiah, a godly king, a very good king, 3 chapters. But most interesting, the book of Kings, the biggest chunk of it is not to the kings. It's 2 people, 2 prophets, Elijah and Elisha. All right, especially 2 Kings, you see a lot of it are the prophets. So though the book is called the Kings, but actually it's the kings that did the spiritual part of the kings, the moral part of the kings, right? And actually the impact of 2 prophets, Elijah and Elisha. Okay, so we see this basically as an overview. So I hope you understand when you see history, you don't expect like chronological, like you studied your secular history, right? So let's see the beginning of this book in 1 Kings. It begins with the last days of King David, and it's so sad. The last days of King David shows him in bed with a strange woman. Of course, he's too old to have sexual relationships, but they had to find a beautiful girl to lie in bed with him to keep him warm. All right, this is it's like telling you, what kind of life King David really had. Very sad. Concubines, many, countless, 7 wives, steals a man's wife. Now in the last scene of him is he's in bed with a young girl, a stranger, a beautiful young girl, right? And then we find that almost his last words to his son Solomon, these are almost his last words. You can find that in 1 Kings chapter 2 or so. His last words are, kill my enemy, Joab. Make sure you kill him. Kill the other guy who insulted me, Shimei. Make sure you kill him. Wow. You mean these are the last words of a guy called King David, whom we all look up to, whom the Bible really says he was a good man? Because why did the Bible say he's a man after God's own heart? Is it because he was, his character was impeccable? No, the important thing, as far as God is concerned, he never went into idolatry. He always looked up to this one God. And he always understood the character of this God in the sense that whenever he did wrong, he repented immediately. He did wrong many times, but he understood the character of God. And God says, this is a man after my own heart. But you look at his life, not exactly exemplary. Okay? Then we see in the last part of David's life, a family feud. One of his sons, Adonijah, tries to grab the throne before his father dies. You see, in the way of the kings of the East, the eldest son is not the automatic next king. It is not. Okay? So Solomon was definitely not the eldest boy, but the king had to decide who his successor was. Could be any one of his sons. And so Adonijah tries to grab it before his father dies. And then David, in his last tottering days, says, he's reminded by his favorite wife, of his many wives, Bathsheba, hey, I thought you told me that Solomon, my son, will be on the throne. How come Adonijah is already grabbing the kingdom? And so David arranges something and Solomon gets the throne. And what does Solomon do when he gets the throne? He kills Adonijah. All right? You see this kind of life. The king's job is to protect his throne, far more than protect the kingdom. Okay? So we see this, and then Solomon begins his reign. All of us remember Solomon as the wise man, the wisest of all men. We remember how he made a decision about the two women arguing whose baby it is. He said, take a sword, cut the baby in half. We always remember these Sunday school stories. Remember how David says he wrote 3,000 proverbs. Many of the proverbs in the Bible are written by Solomon. Okay? And he wrote 1,000 songs. Probably most of them love songs because he had 1,000 wives and concubines. Right? That's crazy, man. Right? And so he also tells us he was a great botanist. He knew everything about animal husbandry. He knew about fish and everything. He knew a lot of stuff. Okay, brilliant, very wise. But you see, wisdom, when it comes to man, there are a lot of areas we can be wise. In fact, when we see someone say, wow, this guy is so brilliant, there's always some weak spots in them. And Solomon obviously had some weak spots. Number one was he loved women, right? I mean, if you're the wisest of all men, would you have 700 wives? I mean, that's not really very wise, right? That's definitely not wise at all, okay? And 300 concubines now. So, wise in many ways, but absolutely foolish in many ways. And that's what we see in human wise men. They seem to be so wise in this and so dumbo in something else. Okay, so that was Solomon. And then he loved to accumulate foreign wives, and the first one mentioned is he married Pharaoh's daughter. It would appear he married Pharaoh's daughter from the verse just before the fact he married her was that it's probably a political alliance. So this guy is wise in politics. He wanted to ally with Egypt, which is like a dominant power, and by marrying the daughter. So we see here Solomon's, almost his first mistake was to marry Pharaoh's daughter. Now what happened was, the Bible tells us, Solomon ended up, all right, having so many wives, and many of them, it says he loved foreign wives. And for foreign wives, he's not supposed to marry a single one, but he married many, and the foreign wives brought in their God worship. And he built palaces for them, and he built places of worship for their gods, and ended up by worshiping them too. So he's a really mixed up guy, if you ask me, all right? Brilliant in some ways, dumb in other ways, worships Jehovah God one way, and worships idols the other way. Okay? So this is the wisest of all men. Well, that's not, I'm glad that one day Jesus will rule, not wise men will rule. Okay? Now we see here, he ends up, when I read about Solomon, he reminds me more of Pharaoh than he does of a king of Israel. All right, these are the first three kings. That's Saul, David, Solomon. Each one had 40-year reign. If I have to make a character study of their reign, you say, tell me in the line, what is Saul's reign? I say, envy and vengeance, right? Send him nuts, send him crazy, right? What about David? He's a messed up guy too, all right? It's not as bad, all right? Still fell for women, a lot of pride in his life, though he knew how to worship the one true God. He wasn't tempted to other gods. Then you say, Solomon, what is his life? His life is just pomp, power, possessions, you know. It's like Pharaoh. It's almost like Pharaoh, very showy guy, okay? And so we see here, he accumulates horses, you read, chariots. He accumulates wives. And in Deuteronomy 17, when God gave instructions, he said, one day you'll have a king. Deuteronomy 17, verse 16 and 17, he said, make sure they don't multiply horses, because horses is a sense of power. And they don't multiply wives. And he did exactly that, Solomon. Okay? So, that's the wisest man of all. Now, what would you say what would most people say was Solomon's greatest achievement? Possibly, some would say he wrote the Proverbs, just like David, he wrote the Psalms, that he left a legacy for us. But for the Jews, probably it was the temple. He built what we call the first temple. You know, for all this time, God was worshipped in a tabernacle. Tabernacle is just another word for a tent. A tent. Like where refugee camps are now, there are tents. Okay? So tabernacle is just a tent for religious use. Basically, that's what it is. For 480 years after they left Egypt, all that God wanted for his house was a tent. Can you imagine a tent after 480 years? I don't even know what it looks like. Right? You pitch a tent outdoors for 4 years. The color runs and it looks pretty shabby. 480 years, I don't know what it looks like. Shabby, right? And yet God was perfectly content to have his presence in that tent. What does that teach us about the character of God? Okay, the character of God doesn't care about these showy things. Otherwise, for 480 years, wouldn't God keep telling them, hey, build a place for me. You guys are in the land already. Build a place. No. So finally, Solomon builds this temple. It's called the first temple, right? Later, the second temple built by Herod, at the time of Jesus, okay, long after this. And if you look at the temple, how would you describe this temple? This is how you would describe it. It's a tabernacle. All the same furniture, the altar, the laver, the lampstand, the table of showbread, incense. But it's an elaborate, expensive version of it. Gold, it's amazing. All right, the tabernacle was basically to depict the when you come into God's presence, the cherubims, and then the palm trees. It's like almost the Garden of Eden and heaven merged together, new heaven, new earth. That's basically the symbol of as you enter into the holy place, to God's presence. One day in Revelation, new heaven, new earth. Cherubim speak of heaven. Palm trees, flowers speak of Eden, right? So this is it, just a super elaborate version. That's what the temple was. It took 7 years to build, right? The temple. He taxed the people heavily, not only in money, but in forced labor. So of course, to build something so elaborate, pure gold, massive, elaborate structure. But where did the taxes and the forced labor go? The Bible says it took 7 years to build the temple. He took 13 years to build his own house. So you got it, right? Twice as much time to build his own house, which is quite typical of Christians. We do give to church something. We are quite happy to give something, but we want to keep the bulk for our luxury. Okay? So when all that taxes came about, the people felt the strain, but of course, because he was good, a strong king, everything was all right. Then Solomon dies, right? Solomon dies, and his next stupidity, so to speak, he chose Rehoboam to be his successor. See, there's the wisest man of all, chooses a fool to be his successor. And Rehoboam is really a fool, okay? And then the kingdom splits into northern kingdom, 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom, 2 tribes, Judah, the tribe of David and Solomon, and Benjamin, makes up the 2 tribes. We just called it Judah because Benjamin is a small tribe, okay? And so now, from now on, in the book of 1 Kings, it's very confusing to read. There are 2 lines of kings, okay? So we see here, the northern line begins with a guy called Jeroboam. Jeroboam is a smart strategist. He said, all right, if we split, we don't want the Rehoboam to rule us. We don't want to pay taxes anymore. All the money goes into his fancy house, his father's fancy house. All right, all the money is stuck to the south. The north is neglected. So Rehoboam had a rebellion, and the 10 tribes of the north joined him. And he figured out, if the temple is still in the south, everybody wants to go to the temple to worship. That's a religious instinct, culture. What I'm going to do, Jeroboam said, I'm going to build something so that the children of Israel, the northern tribes, don't need to go to the temple. So he built 2 golden calves and put them in the north side of his kingdom, Dan, and in the south, Bethel, so that no Israelite really needed to go to the temple because he had this competing religion made of golden calves. Can you imagine at Sinai when they made a golden calf, Aaron made a golden calf, Moses smashed the tabernacle, the 10 commandments, okay? Now they build 2 golden calves. What the golden calves are? That's a religion. Cow is always prosperity. We call it bull market. Make much money. Okay, bull market. All right. So the cow is always a picture of fertility. That's the religion of the land of Canaan. Okay, fertility, religion, and so that replaced Jehovah worship in the north. And all the kings of the north, everyone did evil in the sight of God because all of them worshipped at the golden calves of Dan or Bethel. So the north goes down in a quick spin, okay, and goes into exile first. The south worshipped Jehovah God in the temple and also worshipped in the high places. High place is basically a shrine where little gods are. Call a high place usually on a mountaintop, usually on the top of a pillar, on a treetop, just like how shrines are always made, you have to look up at it. Yeah. And so the southern side was half Jehovah worship and half idol worship. The north is totally idol worship. And so the north goes into exile in 721 or 722 BC. Assyria, not Syria. People confuse. Assyria is not Syria. Assyria is almost at the part where Babylon is, right? And later, the south, 140 years later, go into captivity around that same area, Babylon. And you say, why Babylon? Huh? Because Abraham came out of Babylon. That's his hometown. Of the Chaldees, was Babylon. And now they go right back to where Abraham was. One full circle in the exile. Okay? Now from this point, when the kingdom splits, very difficult to read the first Kings already. Because there are two lines of kings. They get confused. This is the north guy, this is the south guy. The names all sound alike. There are 20 kings in the north, 20 kings in the south. That makes it a bit easy. But the 20 kings in the north come from 9 dynasties because they kill each other. After one, they shoot the other guy, they kill the other guy, and then they replace, and then a coup d'etat, and they take over. So there are 9 dynasties, 20 kings. In other words, average two kings, and then someone comes over and takes over. The southern one, of course, is all the line of David. That's a promise. There'll always be a king sitting on the throne of David. So the southern one, always from David's line. 20 kings, both sides. Okay? But the southern kings lived longer because they went to exile 140 years later. Okay? So the southern kings lived longer, generally speaking, than the northern kings. In fact, someone did a calculation and said, the good kings live average 33 years, the bad kings live average 11 years. I don't know, you're going to do your math on that. Okay? So we see here, the northern kings all were idol worshippers, so all were bad in the eyes of God. Hopeless, gone case. The southern kings, 20 of them, 2 were very good. Remember the names, Hezekiah, Josiah. 6 were not bad. So, pretty good. Right? So 2 very good, 6 or so, 12 were rotten, also idol worshippers. When I say rotten, I mean in the eyes of God, not because they're more stupid or anything, spiritually speaking. This is holy history, all right? Don't forget. All right, so finally, towards the end of 1 Kings, we see a story of Ahab, one horrible king in the north. And this guy literally kills a person because he wants his plot of land, because it's next to his house, next to something convenient for him. So he literally his wife plots to kill this guy to get the land. Wow, you see what kings do in the end? They take advantage of you. They don't protect you. Okay? You can say that for any kind of leader, generally speaking, because the sinful heart is not that different. Ahab is a horrible king, but if you read 1 Kings 22, Ahab, when he was warned by Elijah, said, you took the land. God will punish you. You know what Ahab did? You look at end of 1 Kings 22. Ahab rent his clothes, humbled himself. And you know what God said? All right. I won't punish you. I'll punish the next generation. I hope you see the character of God here. What does God really like? It's a humble heart, willing to say, sorry, God. Right? God's not looking for the super brilliant, perfect people, but humble people who are willing and quick to say, sorry, God. Okay? So then the chapter, 1 Kings ends with a king called Jehoshaphat, one of the good kings of Israel, compromising with the northern kings. In other words, slowly they became so used to the idolatry of the northern kingdom that it was like nothing to them. So Jehoshaphat goes in 1 Kings 22 and says to Ahab, I am as thou art. Huh? You mean there's no difference between the north and the south? And then slowly in the next book of 2 Kings, we see how the southern kingdom too begins. I mean, it went down, but not as fast. And eventually, the northern kingdom becomes totally rotten, and the southern kingdom, 140 years later, becomes totally rotten. Okay, so what do we see from the book of Kings? So many kings, 20, that's 40 already, all right? And plus all the earlier kings. Again, 40, I remember the number 40, yeah? 2020, what does it tell us? Oh, all disappointing, so disappointing. What's wrong with that? Again, the lesson is we yearn for a king. We do. We yearn for leadership. It's not natural. It's called hero worship. If it's not a king, it's a sports star. It's not a sports star, it's a film star. If it's not a film star, it's a gang leader. We need leadership. We look for a leader, but all these leaders fail us. The heart still yearns for a king, a good king. It doesn't exist among men. Jesus Christ, King of kings, Lord of lords, the only king that will satisfy our soul for all